Okay, so we have another issue of our Qualia Structure Journal Club with myself, Niccolo, and this time we're lucky to have Andrew Lee with us. Just as a brief reminder before we jump into Andrew's papers, overall what we've been trying to do with this journal club is to try and examine the ideas of the Qualia Structure Research Project, which broadly is some idea that maybe we'll be able to understand consciousness and how to better research consciousness by exploring the structure of experiences and the relationships between them. So phenomenal structures and the relationship between these phenomenal structures and the similarity or relationships between neural activity or neural processes or physical neurons or whatever. So the neurophenomenal structure, trying to look at the relationship between phenomenal and neurophenomenal structures. And this time we have Andrew Lee with us to discuss probably primarily his paper, Modeling Mental Qualities, which is out now, out last year, and possibly also touching on some of his other papers like Objective Phenomenology and maybe Degrees of Consciousness, which are both, I think, did you say unpublished as of yet, but coming out soon, Andrew?
No, Degrees of Consciousness is forthcoming.
Okay.
It'll be in the news later this year.
Okay, great. And so to start us off, I might try and give a summary of Modeling Mental Qualities as I understood it, and then either Niccolo or Andrew, you can jump in and correct me. So as I see it, the idea of the paper is that it acknowledges there's this pre-existing idea that we can think about experiences, and we can talk about the relationships between experiences by describing them with quality space models. So a traditional one might be, you can talk about a red experience, and you can talk about how a red experience is related to other color experiences by seeing how it varies in some three-dimensional quality space. So maybe from red to green or blue to yellow or black to white, or another way of putting it would be how colors vary in their hue, saturation, or value. But there are some issues with this kind of description of experiences because sometimes it seems like experiences might differ in some other way, that these quality space these ideas of experiences being points in quality spaces makes difficult to describe. So for example, the example given in the paper is considering the experience of red in central vision, where you have a really clear experience of a particular red, so let's say a crimson red, as opposed to an experience of red in peripheral vision, where it's in some sense imprecise, and you don't have the same sense of it being a crimson red or a scarlet red or some other red. So what the paper calls for is, instead of using this standard framework where we think about experiences as single, like infinitely well-defined points in a typical quality space, we can instead think about experiences as regions or areas of these spaces with varying degrees of precision. And that by doing that, we might be able to better describe what experiences are, how experiences can be related to each other, those sorts of things. I think the paper then goes on to describe some other details of like what kinds of regions of quality spaces might experiences be able to take, or how we might be able to go empirically studying these things. But I might just check here that I'm giving an accurate overview of your ideas, Andrew.
Yeah, I think that's all accurate. One minor qualification that I would make is that I don't think it's best to think of mental qualities as being divided into the precise and imprecise mental qualities, and the formal framework that I'm developing as providing a solution to the imprecise ones. Instead, the way I'm thinking about this paper is that it's proposing a more fundamental revision of our standard mental qualities space model framework, where it's not that some mental qualities are represented by points and others by regions, but instead every mental quality should be represented by regions. And then we have, just a general similarity metric for determining the distances between different regions. We have, these new mathematical tools that we use for using and applying the regional framework. So one of the philosophical upshots of the stuff that I'm arguing for here is that it's not that there's like the precise qualities and the imprecise ones, but this is just a general feature of all mental qualities. And that's why we need a revision of our whole framework for modeling mental qualities.
Okay,
Right.
thanks.
So in a sense, like there is a continuum of regions, really. So the experience, the mental qualities would be these regions, and a point would just be a sort of a maximally precise, some sort of ideal mental quality of maximal precision, in a sense, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the unit of analysis is the region, in a sense. Okay. So that's
Yes.
Yeah. Clarify.
So one way of thinking about an analogy is imagine we're trying to like measure the sizes of different physical objects. So, we could make sense of like point-sized physical objects, but that would sort of be an extreme edge case and an idealization. Basically, every case that we're interested in will be cases where a physical object has non-zero size. And I'm thinking of the relationship between mental qualities and regions in an analogous way.
Yeah, so I guess one question I have to begin with is, so I'm very interested in the approach of trying to like map and characterize in an empirical sense these quality spaces. And it's always unclear to me whether we should be starting by thinking about the relationships between experiences, whether that's experiences. Well, actually, maybe I'll take whether we should start by looking at the relationships between experiences, or whether we should start by thinking about the possible dimensions along which experiences can differ from each other, and then trying to like find where in that space they might fit. So I guess what I'm doing a bad job of saying is like how do we know which dimensions might be in a space, or what the space might look like, as opposed to starting by just thinking about the relationships between experiences. Or maybe this is actually also a bad way of describing it, but maybe the simplest way to summarize is the space primary, or are there like relationships between the experiences primary? If that makes sense, or am I still not?
I think that makes sense. Let me say some stuff about that, and then let me from there say a bit more generally about the paper, to make sure that within the context of this discussion, the motivation and just scope of the paper is clarified. So to address the question that you were just raising, I guess the way I think about how we construct these models in the first place is we use a mix of different kinds of empirical data, but maybe the clearest consists of discrimination data. So subjects are asked to make discriminations amongst, say, color chips, and they're able to make a certain number of discriminations, or they're asked to make similarity judgments across different color chips, and they're able to make, their similarity judgments have a certain kind of pattern. Now, in these sorts of cases, the subjects are not attending to their own experiences, but are instead attending to the colors of external objects. But one methodological assumption that I think warrants an inference from these judgments about external objects, about differences between color chips, or similarities between color chips, to differences between color experiences, or similarities between color experiences, is that at least ceteris paribus, it seems plausible that the subjects are making those kinds of discriminations or similarity judgments between the external objects only on the basis of being in the relevant kinds of experiences. Maybe in principle, those two things can go awry. Maybe there could be subjects with weird cognitive systems where their perceptual judgments are messed up. But at least at first pass, this seems like a pretty good methodology for identifying what the structures of our conscious experiences, and in particular, the mental qualities characterizing our experiences are. So I guess the way I think about it is that we start with this sort of empirical data, and that empirical data can be used to construct a model. We can see how many dimensions best captures the range and scope of similarity judgments and discriminatory judgments within that data set. And then, as we do that for color, for example, it turns out that we need 3 dimensions to capture the different ways in which color judgments vary. So then there's usually an extrapolation from the construction of a quality space for the perceptible qualities, like the colors, to the construction of a quality space for the mental qualities, on the grounds that there's the subjects are making the perceptual judgments on the basis of the experiences that they're having. So as far as the question of whether the space is prior or the relations between the qualities prior, I'm not sure how to answer that, in part because I'm thinking that the space is constituted by the relations between the qualities. But if part of the question was also how do we construct these spaces, or identify the relations between the qualities in the first place, I guess I'm thinking it proceeds largely by way of this sort of empirical procedure. And I think oftentimes these models are defeasible, but if we just take the best systematization of the data and infer what seems to be the best explanation of what our experiences are like, then it seems that oftentimes we'll end up with a model of this kind. It's basically a model that best systematizes our similarity judgments and explains how we're able to make the perceptual discrimination and similarity judgments that we're able to make. So just to zoom out a little bit, I guess I'm thinking that what people have typically assumed is that these quality space models should be constructed within what I call the standard framework, where we're modeling individual qualities using points. And as you said, I want to say that we should model qualities using regions. The motivation, you kind of mentioned this, but I just want to make it extra explicit. If you think about like your color experience, say in foveal vision versus peripheral vision, when you see, let's say, an apple in foveal vision, you might see it as a specific shade of red, but when you see it in peripheral vision, you might not see it as any specific shade of red. Instead, your experience might just represent it as red. And there's a difference in phenomenology when you consider the contrast between foveal and peripheral vision. And that difference is what I call precision. And the whole motivation for the regional framework, for moving from points to regions, is to capture precision. And then part of the argument that I was mentioning at the beginning is that when we think about how to model imprecise qualities, we realize that this isn't just an edge case or sort of like a side issue, but instead this warrants a revision of our whole framework for modeling mental qualities, because when you move from points to regions, that has downstream ramifications for other parts of the theoretical framework, like the construction of similarity metrics. And it also has interesting applications, like with how we might construct certain kinds of empirical experiments. So that's just to add a little bit more flesh to the introduction on top of what you were already saying.
Yeah, great. Thanks for summarizing. I just want to check one thing before we go on. So when you say you have an experience of red in central vision, and then you have an experience of red in peripheral vision, but the experience of red in central vision is somehow, in some sense, I'm not necessarily qualitatively different, but there is some way in which it is different from the peripheral vision version. How can we be sure, or like how are we defining the experience of red in central vision and the experience of red in peripheral vision as both red? Just like, is that because a participant will subjectively identify them as the same, even though they might be less clear on what kind of red they're seeing in the periphery?
Well, so I think that the justification for thinking that both are color experiences comes largely from introspection. If you just introspect your foveal color experience versus your peripheral color experience, it seems like you're in a position to know that both are color experiences. Maybe it's hard to know exactly what the relationship between the characters of those experiences are, but it seems like you have some evidence or some grasp through introspection of there being some degree of similarity, in particular, at least similarity with respect to them both being color experiences. There are ways that one could, I mean, there are tricky issues about how to characterize the phenomenology of, say, peripheral color experiences. For example, usually we're attending to things that are seen through foveal vision rather than peripheral vision. And it might be that this difference in attention makes for some differences in phenomenology as well. Then there's a question of whether, that fully explains the difference in phenomenology. I guess I'm inclined to think that it doesn't, that we should also think of there being a difference in the qualities themselves that corresponds to what I'm calling precision.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think introspection as the answer to why we know is a good response, but I do sometimes get, I guess, skeptical responses from other people when you try and assert that maybe these experiences are the same just on the basis of introspection, when behaviorally people can respond to like red seen in the periphery in different ways to red seen centrally, which is why I wanted to check what your take was.
Well, I think, let me say two things there. So one is that there's a lot of debate about how reliable introspection is in contemporary philosophy, especially. But you don't have to take a view that introspection is especially reliable, or that it gives us knowledge of every aspect of our experience, to think that, other things being equal, it provides some evidence for, what the character of our experiences are like. That's a very weak assumption. But also, I think the differences that I'm talking about in phenomenology will also be manifested in behavior and function. We're able to make fewer discriminations in peripheral vision versus foveal vision, but we can still make some color discriminations. So that, I think, is some evidence that we are experiencing colors in peripheral vision, but at a lesser degree of granularity with less precision than in foveal vision.
Okay, great. I have some questions about the technical details of possible spaces, but I think Niccolo has some questions first, so I'll let him go.
I think it's a follow-up actually on what you just asked. So, so if I understand correctly, precision is a property of mental qualities, right? Is a property of mental quality. Okay. So there's also this aspect that I think you touched upon in response to Ariel's question, which is the fact that people can, subjects in an experiment can report the degree of confidence that they have with respect to the color that they see in the peripheral vision. So, for example, if you show me a color in my foveal vision, I say, yeah, it's red, and I am confident and fully confident that it's red. If you show me in the peripheral vision, I could say, yes, it is red, but my degree of confidence is way lower, something like that. So perhaps in an experimental settings, we could rely on confidence ratings, this sort of metacognitive paradigms, to try to model this distinction in precision. But then a possible objection could be something like that, perhaps. And this distinction in precision, upon which the regionality of the model, let's say the region-based model instead of the points-based model depends, might be a property of our metacognitive abilities rather than a property of the mental quality itself, right? Perhaps I report the color in the peripheral vision being imprecise just because I have some sort of limitation in my metacognitive abilities, let's say, put it like roughly. And in that case, the precision wouldn't be a quality wouldn't be a property of the mental quality. How would you respond to that type of objection?
Yeah, no, I agree with you that that's an alternative hypothesis that one might develop. And I think that that falls under a class of alternative hypotheses where there's no differences in precision amongst the qualities of our experience. It's all to be explained either in terms of metacognition or attention or some other kind of awareness property. And I think there's a few things to be said. One, one concerns introspection, as I'd already mentioned. So I think that the introspective evidence, however strong you take that evidence to be, does favor the idea of imprecise qualities. So I think that counts for something. I guess I think also that we get a number of explanatory advantages by appealing to imprecise qualities. So one is that one thing I talk about towards the end of the paper is that we have reason for thinking that even the most precise qualities that we have are still imprecise to some degree, and that this gives us an explanation of what's going on in phenomenal Sorites cases. So these are cases where a subject is able to discriminate A from B, or sorry, is not able to discriminate A from B and not able to discriminate B from C, but can discriminate A from C. So one thing that the paper suggests is here's a way of modeling what's going on in these phenomenal Sorites cases where it involves a certain kind of overlap structure between the relevant regions for the relevant mental qualities. But the interesting thing here is that phenomenal Sorites cases occur even for the foveal color experiences of humans. So I think that's some reason to think that even for our foveal color experiences, we have reason to model it using regions. And then if you're already accepting that there is this feature of mental qualities that, namely imprecision, that's modeled by regions that plays a certain kind of functional role, then that I think makes it very natural to take that property to be modulated, to be greater in peripheral vision than foveal vision. But to step back, I guess generally, I'm inclined to be fairly holist in our methodology here. And I think we should just look at, different theories, and maybe one theory appeals to imprecise mental qualities, another appeals just to metacognitive factors. And I think we just have to assess the evidence in a holistic way and consider all of the different factors pro and against. So I'm not sure if there's any single factor that's decisive, but instead we need to look at what kind of theories as a whole we develop.
I think that's interesting only in that I think down the line, if this approach were more fully developed, it might have some different commitments about what sort of like neural structures you'd expect to see at the end of the day associated with this, where if it was the case that we always had like precise points, I guess, in these regions, but metacognitive issues with like knowing exactly what the experience was, that might be a result of like different brain structure or activity compared to if somehow like you see like experiences of color in the periphery are due to like broader regions or something like that. I can imagine the metacognitive one having a distinct just like distinct either anatomical or activity differences between the two. Not that I can think of the exact experiment to distinguish them immediately.
I think that's right. I mean, I think it would also depend for, experiments. I think it would depend on what the actual like more maturized versions of these theories look like. But I take it that the general thing that you're suggesting is that there would be a structural difference in the phenomenology between the regional framework that I'm advocating for and a purely point-based framework that appeals to like metacognition to explain lower discriminability and peripheral vision and so forth. And if you are thinking that, well, whatever the physical correlates of experience are, they're going to have to be, either isomorphic or at least homomorphic to the structure of our experiences, then we're starting with different views about the structure of experience. So that's going to play different roles in our candidates for the physical correlates of experience.
Yeah. I've got one question, which is, I don't think it was so much addressed in the modeling mental qualities paper, but I think it came up in one of the other papers of yours that you looked at. But I'm just curious as to whether you have any ideas or commitments to what kind of spaces this framework will work with. So is this only really going to work properly with vector spaces with like a clear metric, with like clear dimensionality and distances? Or do you think this approach can work generally, even if we want to be characterizing experiences in affine spaces, topological spaces, any sort of space?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think to answer this question, one thing we should first think about is whether we're just talking about spaces for mental qualities or spaces for characterizing the structure of experiences more generally. For example, if we're thinking about spatial experience, then it's not obvious that the same kind of formal treatment of spatial experience is whether that should be treated formally the same as our treatment of quality spaces. So let's just talk about quality spaces for now. Now,
can I just
one thing,
pause you for a second just to clarify that, because I think I can guess, but I'd like to check the difference between a quality space and the other kind of space you were just talking about?
Well, I guess I'm thinking that quality spaces are spaces that are representing mental qualities like redness, middle C, etc. It's plausible that there are aspects of conscious experiences that are more than just mental qualities. Your experience isn't just this big collection, this big like bag of mental qualities. Instead, those qualities seem to be arranged in a certain way. So you have spatial experience, and maybe there's other kinds of structures to your experience, like mereological structure and so forth. So I guess I'm inclined to be fairly pluralist and think that, well, experiences are these really complex things, and there's probably going to be a lot of different kinds of mathematical representations that we can use for capturing different aspects of experiences. The focus of this paper, Modeling Mental Qualities, is on one class of aspects of experiences, namely qualities. I talk mostly about color, but I think that the considerations apply to any quality space. But that doesn't mean it applies to every feature of experience, because I think it doesn't capture anything like mereological structure, and it's not obvious how to apply it to spatial experience or temporal experience. So suppose that we're restricting first the question that you initially asked to quality spaces. What kinds of spaces should we expect for modeling qualities in general? What I appeal to in the paper, I assume a metric in the paper. I don't assume that it's a vector space. In fact, I think that's one important assumption, because there might be domains of mental qualities where there's no 0 point. So you can't, naturally represent it as a vector space. Or if you do, then you're adding some extra structure to the model that isn't really reflected in the target of the model. So that was actually, I purposely constructed the similarity metric that's talked about in the paper so that it doesn't assume that the space that we're talking about has a 0 point at all. And I think that's one advantage, that it's neutral on that issue. I mean, if we are thinking about spaces, mental qualities that are correspond to vector spaces, it's going to be easy to transport it, but we don't need to. So that's one thing. I don't think we need to assume that the relevant spaces have to be vector spaces. But it does seem to me that we have to assume that the relevant spaces are metric spaces. And that's, I guess I'm inclined to say that mostly because I think that a metric is always going to be needed to capture the similarity relations between different mental qualities. I find it hard to see how it could be the case that, say, a topology is more adequate. It seems like if you just introspect your experiences, like think about your range of color experiences from green to red and so forth. It seems like the similarity relations there, they're best captured not just by, some kind of topology or some kind of ordering, but instead it seems like, red 34 is much more similar to red 33 than like green 33. And that's just a fact of the matter about similarity. So this seems to me to be a very general consideration that the similarity relations between different mental qualities is always going to be capturable using a metric rather than something weaker. And for that reason, I think that we should, at least I find it hard to conceive of how we could have a domain of mental qualities that's best captured by, say, merely a topology rather than a metric.
Yeah, so I agree that I also find it very hard to conceive of similarity except in a metric space. But the reason why I ask is when I go and I ask participants for similarity relationships, sometimes I do see things that violate metric assumptions. So sometimes I see asymmetry, sometimes I see triangle inequality violations. And there's also work by, I know there's a good paper by Enes and Zaidi, I think from a few years ago, where they ask people to look at they use a different measure to look at similarities between colors, but they show, at least they claim in their paper, that like an affine space model actually gives a better description of people's color experiences. But they also then show that like depending on how they phrase the questions to their participants, their responses better fit a metric structure or an affine structure. But I guess the general point is like, it's not always obvious when I start with my set of like participant data and I'm then trying to construct some quality space, whether I should be assuming that it's a metric space, and when I see deviations from that, that it's because my participants are inconsistent, or they are confused, or they put the wrong number down, or like some sort of error is going on, or whether like I should be definitely trying to make sure that I use as unstructured a space to initially characterize their judgments as possible. And if it turns out that they consistently violate metric assumptions, then I should be throwing out my metric model. I don't have data, and I don't think other people necessarily do, that's like so clearly saying that like metric spaces for quality spaces is wrong, but it's just something that I always think about when I do see any minor violations of metric space assumptions.
Yeah, I mean, here, I guess it seems to me like it's going to depend more on the philosophical issues and one's philosophical commitments than on anything that can be adjudicated empirically. But I guess speaking for myself, I'm inclined to think that if you introspect your experiences, your color experiences, then you can just grasp, in virtue of knowing the phenomenal characters of those experiences, that there is more than just like an ordering on the similarity relations, and that this is something that we can come to know through our grasp of our own experiences. And that's what provides justification for, in these kinds of cases that you're talking about, of interpreting the subject's, say, like judgments that violate triangle inequality as involving some kind of perturbation between the experience itself and the judgment that's produced. So it seems to me like we have to just take that data to be partly a matter of noise or some other sort of deviation occurring in the psychophysical process. But if one were to construct a model of mental qualities of a quality space where there is no metric structure, I find it hard to conceive of how that could, how to make sense of that, how that could possibly capture all of the structure of the relevant domain.
Yeah, I am aware of other models, but I can't do a great job of describing them. But maybe there's some more philosophical work that can be done there to see whether they can be reconciled. Niccolo looks like he's laughing at me.
No, I wasn't laughing at you, don't worry. do have a question, but it might take us towards metaphysics. So if you have other questions on the technical details, Ariel, feel free. Good. So the question that I had, I think, so you, Andrew, you say quite clearly that you want to remain neutral on this topic, but I figure I would ask you anyway. So it's something actually that we looked at in other sessions of this journal club. So this idea that studying the structure of consciousness is important, is relevant, because it can tell us something about the nature of experience, right? The nature of conscious experiences, right? And there are some accounts that say that the relational structure that this experience, right, as with other experiences, exhaust the phenomenal nature of that experience. So seeing red, the experience of seeing red is just defined as the relational structure that experience has with the experience of seeing blue, seeing green, and so on, right? There's no, if you want, categorical basis. It's just pure relation. Okay, once you have the relational profile, you have the experience. I was wondering, do you partially agree with that? Do you? I think your model, your framework can be applied in either case, whether one agrees with that or not, to be honest. But do you want to take a stance towards this sort of more metaphysical debate? Do you think that the focusing on the structure of consciousness can tell us something on the metaphysical nature of consciousness at the end of the day, or not?
So let me answer a couple questions that I think were embedded in there. So first, the kind of view that you were just sketching, where the phenomenal character is grounded in the relations that individual experiences have to one another. I don't agree with that view. So I'm somebody who thinks that in general, we should distinguish between intrinsic properties of experiences and structural properties. I think that questions about the structure of experience have been somewhat neglected in contemporary consciousness studies. One thing that I often like to say is that in philosophy of consciousness, people have spent so much time focused on the metaphysical nature of consciousness, of what consciousness fundamentally is, whether it's physical or not physical. And I mean, I think these are important questions. That's the sort of stuff that first drew me into thinking about consciousness in the first place. But there's also all sorts of questions we could ask about the structures of conscious experiences. And, you know, as an analogy, think about investigation of the physical world. We could ask questions about the metaphysical nature of the physical world, whether like physicality is primitive, whether idealism is true, whether everything is computational, things like that. We could also ask questions about the structure of the physical world. And that's like all of science. And, you know, I think there's an enormous contrast between just the range and richness of questions that we can ask about the structure of the physical world versus the metaphysical nature. So, I mean, that's part of why I think that there's similarly a lot of questions we should be asking about the structures of conscious experiences that have been sort of cast to the side because of these puzzles about the nature of consciousness. But let me return to this question about relationalism versus you know, the view that consciousness has intrinsic properties. So as far as I can tell, I think that this idea that the phenomenal characters of experiences are determined by relations, it seems to me that that view is sometimes expressed in an ambiguous way, and I'm not always sure which of the precisifications people have in mind. So one interpretation of that claim is that if you fix all of the relational properties, that'll fix the phenomenal character. So that's sort of just a supervenience claim. Another interpretation is that the phenomenal character just is the relations. So that's more than supervenience. That's making a grounding or constitution or more substantive metaphysical claim. I think that it's not, I think the supervenience claim is not totally obvious either way. Maybe it is the case that every single experience has a unique relational profile. That's compatible with thinking that experiences have intrinsic properties that are not exhausted by their structural properties. It might be that their structural properties, as a matter of fact, determine the identity of their intrinsic properties without grounding those intrinsic properties. The stronger view is that there are no intrinsic properties to experiences, that there are just relational properties. And I have a hard time making sense of this view. One reason is that I think introspection puts us in contact with intrinsic properties of our experiences. And I think there are ways of making sense of that systematically. I guess I also think that I find it puzzling how to interpret at least stronger versions of this purely relational view. So for example, all of us, the three of us, have color experiences and a certain state space for those color experiences. But we could imagine our cognitive systems being altered a little bit so that there's a bigger range of color experiences, say, that I can have, or let's say a smaller range that Niccolo can have. Now, if the identities of experiences are determined purely by their relations to other experiences, then it seems to me that that's going to predict that now I just have a totally different set of experiences, because the entire structure that characterizes my color experiences has now been altered, and the entire structure that characterizes your color experiences has now been altered. But that seems very strange, right? Because it seems plausible that there could be slight perturbations in the set of possible color experiences that a subject could have without substantively, systematically altering all of the other color experiences that that subject could have. So that's one thing that I have trouble making sense of concerning the purely relational view. But I guess I also think that appealing to intrinsic properties, there's a way of doing that while respecting the, possibility of scientific work on consciousness, and while being a naturalist about consciousness. Yeah, it seems to me like there's a systematic way of making sense of the idea of consciousness having intrinsic properties without thinking that's anything spooky or weird or metaphysically suspicious, and that this is the default view. And if we can make sense of that view, and also if it has certain explanatory advantages, like explaining why we think there's a hard problem, for example, then that's going to be the better view.
Yeah, that's a good description. I just want to check that I understand, and the implications of what you're saying are what I think they are. So let's take the case of anomalous trichromats. So like the most common form of color blindness, it's like almost 5 to 10, maybe I'm not quite right on that, but it's a single digit percentage of males, I think, who have it, where they have an alteration of one of their cones, but they still have 3 distinct cone types. And the question people have is like, what is the mental quality space of these people like? Or do they have the same color experiences in a sense as like normal trichromats? Because obviously we will see there's a different stimulus experience relationship that these people have. And you can see that there are stimuli they can discriminate that normal trichromats can't, and vice versa. But if you look and you try and map out their like quality space, you can still see like a 3-dimensional metric space, quality space. And I guess what you were saying from your description is that we wouldn't be able to know whether that, just because it has the same quality space of mental qualities, that doesn't tell us whether the color experiences of the anomalous trichromat are the same as the color experiences of the normal trichromat. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that knowing the structure of the relevant state spaces, of the relevant spaces for their mental qualities, underdetermines what the experiences that the anomalous trichromats versus normal vision people have. That's not to be a skeptic. So I think that we can still make reasonable inferences as to what the relevant experiences are. But it seems to me like if we know the structure, if all we know is the structure of the relevant quality spaces, that still leaves open questions about what the character of those experiences are. Whereas I'm not sure if the relationalists can say that, because if all there is to the phenomenal character of the experiences is their relational properties or the structure that they're embedded in, then we have all the information that we need in that sort of circumstance. But then that seems puzzling because it still seems like there's an open question as to what we should think about the experiences of the anomalous trichromats.
Yeah, I think I agree basically with what you just said completely. And I just think that relationists would have a different intuition where they would say, well, like, obviously, if their description of their quality space is the same, it seems absurd to think that these other people might have alien experiences compared, like alien color experiences or completely different color experiences to those of the typical trichromats.
So there's another angle that you might approach this from. It seems at least conceivable that there could be quality spaces consisting of qualities that are quite different from, say, color, but that form a similar structure that maybe also involve a three-dimensional space that's bounded in similar ways. So, I mean, that also seems like an open question. Even if we have two spaces that are similar, then there's an open question of how similar the experiences associated with those two spaces are. And then on the other hand, if we have two spaces that are different, there's again a question of how similar the associated experiences are. So it seems to me that there's this double dissociation that disfavors the relational view. Yeah,
I would agree at least that it's not something that relationists can prove would be the case, whether there would be an equivalence of experience in both circumstances or not. Niccolo, do you have any other metaphysical questions?
Well, no, maybe since we're towards the end, we might want to touch on the other paper. I think perhaps this discussion might touch on the idea of objective phenomenology, perhaps. So in a sense, like we could still say something like, look, yeah, we don't want to say that the structural property of consciousness are the only thing that that constitutes consciousness. Do not exhaust the phenomenal character of our experiences, but they are still relevant because they provide us with a new angle to understand like the phenomenon of consciousness, right? And I think in the objective phenomenology paper, so you say something like this, right? That the structural properties are an objective fact, if I understand correctly, right? So they still belong to a point of view, but they are accessible from any point of view. Is that right?
Yeah, so to be precise, my main claim in that paper is that purely structural facts about experiences, meaning facts that describe only structural properties of experiences and not qualitative properties like painfulness or redness and so forth, that these purely structural facts about experiences are objective phenomenal facts. Objective meaning that they can be understood given any point of view, any set of experiential capacities. So this is the notion of objective that Thomas Nagel talked about, and that was featured famously at the end of his What It's Like to Be a Bat, where he kind of speculated about the idea or about the possibility of developing an objective phenomenology that could characterize experiences in a way that would be understandable even by those who are unable to have the experiences under question. So I think that an objective phenomenology is possible, though in a limited way. If we describe the structures of experiences, if I give you a model of a certain domain of experiences, like the sort of thing that I'm doing in the modeling mental qualities paper, I think I'm telling you some objective facts about experiences. And even if you didn't have color experiences or auditory experiences or whatever the relevant domain is, you would still be able to understand what it means to say that these experiences have this kind of structure, that they're modeled by, say, this kind of space with the similarity metric looking like this. Whereas I think for other kinds of phenomenal facts, the more familiar kinds, like pain experience feels like this, color experience feels like this, I think that those are not understandable from just any point of view. You have to be able to grasp what the phenomenal characters of those experiences are, and to do that, you have to have a certain kind of experiential profile, to have certain kinds of experiential capacities.
So it might be just a terminological issue, but isn't like more this sense of objectivity isn't like more intersubjectivity, in a sense that it requires that there is a point of view in the first place, right? Like to grasp those structural properties, those structural facts. If those structural facts are about a point of view, right? I can grasp those facts only if I have a point of view in the first place, right? If it comes from a point of view. Isn't this more similar to intersubjectivity?
We could call it intersubjectivity if you want. So the term objective is pretty ambiguous. There's several different ways of precifying it. But the notion of objective that Thomas Nagel used is the same one that I'm using in that paper. There's other senses of objective, like meaning free from bias or dependent on just reality rather than people's opinions. And those are sort of just different meanings of the term objective. You're also right that the objective phenomenal facts that I'm talking about, namely purely structural facts, to understand those facts, I think one still has to have a concept of experience itself. And having a concept of experience itself is something that requires one to have some experiences. So I think zombies do not have concepts of experiences, for example. But I think it's more than merely intersubjective in the sense of being graspable by multiple subjects, because the sense of objectivity here is that it's graspable no matter what point of view one occupies.
Yeah, okay. I think that's very helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so the this stuff about objective phenomenology, I think this could also be thought of as another way of motivating the theoretical interest of investigating the structures of conscious experiences. In addition to, the stuff that we were talking about before, these are also objective phenomenal facts, at least if I'm right. And I think that's pretty cool to be engaging in that kind of project.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in trying to investigate some of these objective phenomenological properties or structural properties. Like I have spoken to, for example, there's a paper on recent IIT, integrated information structure theory, by Tononi and Horn about the nature of spatial experience. And they make in the first part of the paper all these claims about the phenomenology of spatial experience, but they're all just claims rather than like backed up by either psychophysical or phenomenological or experimental philosophy actual like data from participants beyond like I think the introspection of the authors. And it certainly, I would find it very interesting if what you're describing here in terms of more structural investigations were to go on generally. So I guess what I'm getting around to is, are there any particular experiments or any particular data sets that you would like to see collected that you think would help with this project? Or do you think this is more just like work for philosophy to be done and people to reevaluate pre-existing data?
I think that this general project is certainly something that should be pursued in an interdisciplinary way. I think that there's roles for philosophers and for scientists. But I think one thing that, in my opinion, is a bit under-researched and it's not necessarily in the province of just philosophers, but maybe philosophers are well suited to thinking about this. You sometimes see different models of different aspects of conscious experiences without too much discussion of how to interpret those models. And I think one thing that's very important for this sort of investigation is to really explain what the proper interpretation of any kind of model is. Because otherwise, I think we just have some, mathematical structure without understanding exactly how it maps onto the phenomenon that's being represented. And I think that in order to get better or clearer interpretations, we have to just do more investigation of the structures of conscious experiences themselves. Maybe one way to put it is that I guess I'm inclined to think that there's lots of different features of experiences, and it's just not very obvious how to break them down in systematic ways. And to make progress on this, it seems to me that we're going to have to really take things slowly and examine things carefully and ask for every particular formal structure, does this actually adequately capture the thing that we're trying to capture? So to relate this to the paper on space that you were mentioning, it seemed like you were suggesting, well, they're starting from certain assumptions about the structure of spatial experience, and then developing, a bunch of formalisms around those assumptions. And I guess I'm expressing agreement with the sentiment that it's something that's it would be theoretically valuable for there in general to be more investigation of whether those sorts of initial assumptions are justified or not, whether when one is proposing something about the structures of conscious experiences or one particular structure associated with consciousness, whether that is in fact being done from a theory neutral way, or if not, what exactly the assumptions are, and more also what exactly the meaning, the interpretation of the particular model being proposed is. I guess I generally have the feeling that there's, especially nowadays, more and more excitement about investigation of the structures of conscious experiences, but it seems to me that we can't really do this adequately without also doing some hard philosophical work about what, how we're actually thinking about the target phenomenon.
Strongly agree with that.
Yeah, I think we probably all three of us agree there. That also seems like maybe a good point to end. So I will stop the recording there.